Sometime in the middle of the 1990s, if you flew into Las Vegas at night, which is the only way you should ever approach Las Vegas for the first time if you can help it, you would see something from the airplane window that didn't look real. You would see a narrow corridor of light, so intense and so concentrated in the middle of an absolute void of desert blackness that it looked less like a city and more like something that had been dropped there from another dimension entirely. A fever dream of neon and electricity sitting in the middle of one of the most hostile, waterless, sun-blasted stretches of land on the North American continent, glowing so hard it was visible from 100 miles out. And if you were landing at McCarran International, which millions of people were doing every single year by that point, the pilot would begin the descent over mountains, and then suddenly there would be nothing below you but flat darkness, and then all at once the strip would appear out your window, like someone had flipped a switch, the Luxor's pyramid shooting a beam of white light straight up into space, the MGM Grand's green glass tower, the Mirage's volcano, the Treasure Island's pirate ship out front on the sidewalk, all of it crammed together into roughly 4 miles of Las Vegas Boulevard South that represented, at that particular moment in American history, the single most concentrated collection of architectural excess, entertainment capital, and pure human audacity anywhere on the surface of the planet. And the thing that should absolutely stop you in your tracks, the thing that should make you put down whatever you're doing and actually think about it for a moment, is not what Las Vegas looked like from that airplane window in 1995. It's what Las Vegas looked like from that same airplane window in 1935. Which is to say, nothing. Sand, rock, a railroad junction, and a few thousand people scraping out an existence in a place where the summer temperature regularly exceeds 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and there is essentially no water. Nothing about Las Vegas makes sense. Nothing about the fact that it exists, that it's the size it is, that it draws the number of people it draws, that it generates the revenue it generates, that it built the skyline it built. Nothing about any of it makes sense when you hold it up against the basic facts of its geography and its history. And yet here it is, the most improbable city in America. Maybe the most improbable city in the history of organized human settlement. And if you're going to understand how it actually happened, you have to be willing to follow the real story from the very beginning, which starts not with casinos and not with the mob, and not with Frank Sinatra, but with a railroad survey crew standing in the Mojave Desert in 1855, staring at a patch of spring-fed grass, and making a decision that, without any of them knowing it at the time, would eventually produce one of the most extraordinary urban explosions in recorded history. Stick around and subscribe right now, because this is the story of how Las Vegas became Las Vegas, and there is honestly nothing quite like it in the history of American cities. The spring-fed meadow that gave Las Vegas its name, which is Spanish for the meadows, had been used by travelers for centuries before any American survey crew ever showed up. The Paiute people knew about it and used it as a reliable water source in an otherwise brutally dry landscape. The Spanish and Mexican trade route known as the Old Spanish Trail, which connected Santa Fe to Los Angeles, passed through the valley specifically because of those springs, because you could not cross the Mojave Desert without water, and there wasn't much of it out there, and those springs at Las Vegas were one of the few places where you could reliably find it. John C. Fremont, the American explorer and army officer, stopped at the Vegas Valley on one of his expeditions in 1844 and noted the springs in his journal with the kind of matter-of-fact appreciation that someone who has been traveling through the Mojave Desert for any length of time naturally develops for anything that is wet and drinkable. Mormon missionaries established a small fort and settlement at Las Vegas in 1855, farming the spring-fed land and trying to maintain a mission outpost between Salt Lake City and California. But the settlement didn't last long, maybe 2 years before it was abandoned, and the valley went back to being essentially a rest stop on a transcontinental road rather than a destination in itself. The thing that fundamentally changed Las Vegas's relationship to the wider world was not a policy decision or an entrepreneurial vision, or even a lucky discovery of mineral resources. It was a railroad, and specifically the decision by the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, which was controlled by Senator William Clark of Montana, to build a line connecting Salt Lake City to Los Angeles. The route they surveyed in the early 1900s ran straight through the Las Vegas Valley, and the valley's artesian water supply made it genuinely attractive as a division point, a place where the railroad could stop, service its engines, and house its workers. In May of 1905, the railroad held a land auction in Las Vegas that essentially created the town site from scratch in a single afternoon, selling lots in a grid-planned community to buyers who showed up by train from Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. Within hours, Las Vegas had a real estate market. Within a year, it had a few thousand residents, a handful of hotels and saloons, and the basic skeleton of an actual town. It was, from the very first moment of its existence as an organized American municipality, a service economy built around traffic passing through rather than anything the land itself produced. That's not a detail. That is the fundamental DNA of Las Vegas, and it never changed, it just kept scaling. For the next 2.5 decades, Las Vegas was a railroad town. Modest, dusty, functional, not particularly distinguished from dozens of other small Western railroad service communities strung along transcontinental routes across the desert Southwest. It had a few thousand people, a main street, some businesses catering to railroad workers and travelers, and essentially nothing that would have made an outside observer predict anything remarkable in its future. Nevada was a sparse, hard state, mostly mining and ranching, with a few railroad towns and a capital city in Carson City that nobody outside Nevada had much reason to think about. Clark County, which contained the Las Vegas Valley, had fewer than 5,000 residents in the 1920 census. It was, by any objective measure, a backwater, tucked into the corner of a state that was already one of the least populated in the country, a very long way from anything that could be described as a center of American economic or cultural life. And then, in the span of about 3 years in the early 1930s, two things happened that remade Las Vegas so completely that the railroad junction town that had existed before almost ceased to be relevant as a reference point for understanding what came after. The first was a decision made in Washington, D.C., by the federal government, and the second was a decision made in Carson City by the state legislature of Nevada, and together, they didn't just change Las Vegas, they essentially invented it. The federal decision was to build Hoover Dam. The Bureau of Reclamation had been planning a major dam on the Colorado River for years, understanding that controlling the Colorado's flow was essential for managing water rights and agricultural development across the entire Southwest. In 1928, Congress authorized the Boulder Canyon Project Act, committing to the construction of what would become the largest dam in the world at the time of its completion. The construction site was located in the Black Canyon of the Colorado River, about 35 miles southeast of Las Vegas. The closest settlement of any real size to the construction project was Las Vegas, which made it the natural staging point for the massive federal workforce and supply operation that would be needed to build a structure of that scale in that location. The Bureau of Reclamation actually built its own dedicated town called Boulder City a few miles from the dam site to house construction workers, a strictly controlled federal municipality where gambling was prohibited and alcohol was regulated, a deliberately sober and orderly place designed to keep the workforce productive. But Boulder City was never going to absorb all the economic and social energy generated by 5,000-plus workers, with paychecks burning holes in their pockets. And Las Vegas, which was right there, and which had no such restrictions, absorbed the rest. Bars, brothels, gambling halls, entertainment of every variety. All of it exploded in Las Vegas during the Hoover Dam construction years, from 1931 to 1936, feeding on federal money that was, paradoxically, flowing into one of the worst economic catastrophes in American history. The Great Depression was gutting the country while Boulder Dam was being built, and the New Deal money flowing into that construction project was one of the only significant economic engines operating at full speed in the whole region. Las Vegas became its pressure valve, the place where the people building the dam went to spend their money and forget, for a few hours, that the world outside the canyon was falling apart. The Nevada decision was, if anything, even more consequential for Las Vegas's long-term trajectory, and it happened just a few weeks before construction on Hoover Dam actually began. In March of 1931, the Nevada State Legislature passed Assembly Bill 98, legalizing wide-open gambling across the entire state. Nevada had experimented with gambling prohibition and had repealed it before, but the 1931 law was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. A broad, explicit legalization that allowed casino-style gambling to operate openly, with a licensing system that generated state revenue and provided a degree of regulatory oversight in every county in Nevada. At the same moment, the legislature also made Nevada's divorce laws the most permissive in the country, reducing the residency requirement for divorce to just 6 weeks, which created an entirely separate tourism economy around divorce ranches, where well-heeled Americans came to wait out their residency requirement in the Nevada desert. But that's almost a footnote compared to the gambling legalization in terms of long-term impact on Las Vegas. The combination of the Hoover Dam construction workforce, the most permissive gambling laws in America, easy access by road and rail from California, and a climate that allowed outdoor activity for most of the year was enough to get things moving. By the time Hoover Dam was completed and dedicated in 1935, Las Vegas had grown substantially and had established itself, at least regionally, as a place where the rules were different, where things were available that weren't available most other places, where you could come and do things you couldn't do back home. That was the foundation. What got built on top of that foundation over the following 7 decades is the actual story of how a small desert railroad town became the entertainment capital of the world. The 1940s are where the mythology of Las Vegas really begins, and the mythology is inseparable from one particular man whose story has been told so many times and so dramatically that it can be genuinely difficult to separate the actual historical facts from the layers of legend that have accumulated around them. Bugsy Siegel was a New York organized crime figure, a member of the Murder Incorporated enforcement arm of the Eastern Mob, a genuinely violent and dangerous man who by all accounts had a vision for Las Vegas that the people around him, both in the mob and in the legitimate investment world, thought was either delusional or suicidal. The story as it's usually told is that Siegel arrived in Las Vegas in the mid-1940s, saw something nobody else could see, and decided to build something nobody else would have dared to build: the Flamingo Hotel and Casino, a resort that borrowed its aesthetic vocabulary not from the dusty frontier saloon tradition of existing Las Vegas gambling establishments, but from the glamorous, poolside, Hollywood luxury world that Siegel had spent years adjacent to through his connections in Los Angeles. He wanted the Flamingo to feel like a Beverly Hills hotel that happened to have a casino in it, a resort where you could swim by the pool during the day, watch a major Hollywood entertainer perform in the showroom at night, and gamble in a room that didn't feel like a dive bar with card tables. He wanted, in other words, to make Las Vegas feel aspirational rather than just permissive, to make it a destination rather than a detour. The project went catastrophically over budget, partly due to cost overruns and construction chaos, and partly, allegedly, due to systematic skimming by Siegel's construction partners. His mob backers were furious. The Flamingo opened disastrously in December 1946, half-finished, drawing almost no one, losing money at a rate that made everyone involved deeply nervous. Siegel was shot and killed in Beverly Hills in June 1947, sitting on the couch in his girlfriend's living room, in what has never been officially attributed to anyone, but which the mob generally gets blamed for in every account written since. He was 41 years old. The Flamingo, refitted and reopened under different management in the months after his death, eventually began to succeed. And the model he had built, the full resort experience, hotel plus showroom plus casino plus pool, began to spread up and down Las Vegas Boulevard in a way that would eventually produce one of the most extraordinary stretches of commercial real estate in the history of American development. The Flamingo's success in the late 1940s and into the 1950s triggered a wave of mob-connected hotel-casino construction along what was then simply known as Highway 91, the road connecting Las Vegas to Los Angeles, which would eventually be renamed Las Vegas Boulevard, and which everyone would eventually just call the Strip. The Desert Inn opened in 1950, backed by a Cleveland organized crime figure named Mo Dalitz. The Sahara opened in 1952, the Sands in 1952, the Riviera in 1955, the Tropicana in 1957. One after another, enormous hotel casinos rose along the highway south of downtown Las Vegas, each one trying to outdo its neighbors in scale and glamour, each one importing showroom talent from Hollywood and New York, each one building a bigger pool and a more elaborate themed lobby and a more glittering casino floor than the last. This was the era that most powerfully shaped Las Vegas's global image, the Las Vegas of the Rat Pack, of Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. performing at the Sands, while the rest of the country was watching them on television, the Las Vegas of million-dollar entertainers and high-rolling gamblers, and a social freedom, racially complicated and morally ambiguous and absolutely real, that genuinely did not exist most other places in 1955 America. Las Vegas in the 1950s was a place where the color line was, not absent by any means, The casinos were disgracefully segregated in ways that regularly humiliated even the black entertainers headlining their showrooms. Sammy Davis Jr. was not allowed to stay in the hotels where he performed, a fact that hangs over the romantic mythology of the Rat Pack era, with deserved weight. But the city's general atmosphere of transgression and rule-bending extended to racial mixing on casino floors and in entertainment venues in ways that were, for the mid-1950s American South and Midwest, genuinely unusual, and that contributed to Las Vegas's sense of being a place where different rules applied. That reputation, the sense that Las Vegas was fundamentally other, a place outside the normal moral and social geography of American life, was enormously valuable and enormously durable, and it has essentially never worn off. The money flowing through Las Vegas in the 1950s was spectacular and systematically stolen. The organized crime families who controlled the major hotel casinos had perfected a technique called skimming, taking cash off the top of the casino's take before it was counted and reported for tax purposes, meaning the federal government was being defrauded of tax revenue on an industrial scale. The FBI and the IRS were aware of it and trying to build cases against the casino operators, but the cash-intensive nature of casino operations made the fraud extraordinarily difficult to prove or quantify. Howard Hughes, the eccentric aviation and aerospace billionaire, arrived in Las Vegas in 1966 and began buying hotel casinos in what was partly a genuine real estate investment strategy and partly the behavior of a profoundly reclusive billionaire who had decided to seal himself into the top floor of the Desert Inn because he liked having his own space and couldn't be made to leave, so he simply purchased the building. Hughes ended up buying the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Castaways, the Frontier, the Silver Slipper, and the Landmark Hotel over the following years, and his involvement, whatever its eccentricities, had the effect of beginning to shift Las Vegas's ownership structure away from mob-connected operators towards something that looked more like conventional corporate real estate investment. That shift accelerated enormously in 1969, when Nevada passed the Corporate Gaming Act, which allowed publicly traded corporations to obtain gambling licenses for the first time, removing the requirement that every individual stockholder in a casino company be personally investigated and licensed, which had previously made corporate ownership of casinos essentially impossible. That law, more than almost any other single piece of legislation in Nevada history, is responsible for the modern Las Vegas, because it opened the door to the corporate capital that financed everything that came after. The 1970s in Las Vegas are sometimes overlooked in the standard narrative, sandwiched between the glamorous mob era of the 50s and 60s and the corporate mega-resort era of the 80s and 90s, but they deserve attention because they're when the infrastructure for the later explosion actually got built. Kirk Kerkorian, an Armenian-American billionaire who had made his early fortune in charter aviation and real estate, built the original MGM Grand in 1973, which at the time was the largest hotel in the world, with over 2,000 rooms. That size alone represented a conceptual shift in how Las Vegas thought about itself, away from the relatively intimate resort model of the Flamingo-era properties, and towards something that could only be described as mass tourism, enormous volume, commodified entertainment, accessible to a much broader swath of the American middle class than the celebrity gambling culture of the Rat Pack era had ever been designed for. The mid-1970s also brought the opening of what is now called the Las Vegas Hilton, another enormous property, and a general trend towards scale that would only accelerate over the following decades. The 1970s also brought, not entirely coincidentally, the beginning of the end for the mob. A combination of FBI investigations, federal prosecutions, the increasing involvement of corporate owners and institutional investors who had no tolerance for the legal exposure that came with organized crime connections, and eventually the dramatic testimony of mob informants in federal proceedings through the late 1970s and 1980s gradually stripped the major mob families of their Las Vegas holdings and replaced them with a generation of corporate casino operators whose names most people today would recognize because their companies are still running the Strip. Steve Wynn, who will be central to the next phase of this story, got his start operating a small casino downtown in the 1970s, before his ambitions and his access to capital grew far beyond anything the downtown Fremont Street scene could contain. What happened to Las Vegas in the 1980s was a continuation of the corporatization trend, steady and significant, but not yet spectacular. The mob was being pushed out. Corporate operators were consolidating. Earnings were growing. The city's population, which had been growing steadily since the dam construction days, was now growing with genuine velocity, as casino and hotel jobs drew workers and their families from across the country, as the retirement community around the Las Vegas Valley expanded, as service sector employment grew to support an ever larger tourist population. By 1980, the Las Vegas metropolitan area had roughly 500,000 residents, a number that would roughly double by 1990 and double again by 2000, making Las Vegas one of the fastest-growing major metropolitan areas in American history, an expansion so fast and so sustained that it strained every dimension of city infrastructure simultaneously. Roads and schools and water and power and housing and emergency services, all perpetually struggling to catch up with a population that kept arriving faster than any of those systems could be built out to accommodate them. The water situation alone deserves its own careful examination, because Las Vegas sits in one of the most water-scarce environments in North America, and yet managed to grow into a metropolitan area of 2 million people, largely by securing an extremely aggressive allocation from the Colorado River under the 1922 Colorado River Compact, and then using every tool of desert water conservation and reclamation engineering available to stretch that allocation as far as physically possible. The Las Vegas Valley Water District became, of necessity, one of the most sophisticated and innovative water management agencies in the country, pioneering indoor-use reclamation systems that recycled treated wastewater back into Lake Mead and counted it against the city's Colorado River allocation, which meant that the water used inside Las Vegas hotels and casinos could effectively be used twice, an approach that allowed the city to grow far beyond what its raw water allocation number alone would have suggested was possible. And then came 1989, and the opening of the Mirage, and everything changed again. Steve Wynn had spent the decade carefully building his position and his reputation, acquiring the Golden Nugget downtown, and turning it into a genuinely upscale property in an area of Las Vegas that had never been associated with upscale anything, proving along the way that design quality and operational excellence could meaningfully differentiate a casino in a market where most visitors were making their choices based on which property had the loosest slots and the cheapest shrimp cocktail. He took the Golden Nugget concept to Atlantic City and made money there. And then he came back to Las Vegas with an idea that, like Bugsy Siegel's original vision for the Flamingo 40 years earlier, struck almost everyone who heard it as either visionary or insane, depending on how much of the money was coming out of your pocket. Wynn wanted to build a resort that wasn't primarily a casino that happened to have a hotel attached to it. He wanted to build a destination, a place so spectacular, so surprising, so unlike anything that currently existed, that people would travel specifically to see and experience it, regardless of whether they had any particular interest in gambling. He wanted to give Las Vegas a reason to exist beyond just its gambling license. The Mirage, which opened on November 22, 1989, cost $630 million, which was at the time the most expensive hotel ever built. A number so staggering that the conventional wisdom in the industry was that it could not possibly generate enough revenue to service the debt it had taken on. The casino floor would need to generate about $1 million a day, every day, just to break even. Wall Street analysts thought it was a catastrophic overreach. They were wrong in a way that permanently altered their understanding of what a destination resort could do. The Mirage worked. It worked spectacularly, beyond almost any financial projection that had been made before it opened. The artificial volcano out front, which erupted on a schedule every 15 minutes after dark and shot actual flames and water into the Las Vegas Boulevard air, became immediately the most photographed thing in Nevada and one of the most recognizable attraction images in American tourism. The white tigers exhibited in a habitat in the lobby, part of Siegfried and Roy's act, which performed nightly in the showroom for years, were something people came to Las Vegas specifically to see, not as a secondary activity around gambling, but as a primary reason for the trip. The atrium, the tropical interior garden, the general sense of overwhelming, almost hallucinatory spectacle that the entire property projected, these weren't marketing gimmicks. They were a genuinely new proposition for what a hotel could be. The idea that the building itself, the experience of simply being inside it and walking around it, was an attraction worth traveling for. When Wynn proved that this model could generate not just enough revenue to service the Mirage's debt, but genuine profit, enormous profit, the reaction from the rest of the casino industry was essentially instantaneous. If the Mirage could work, then a more spectacular Mirage could work even better, and the race to build something bigger and more extravagant and more spectacular than the thing that just opened was often a way that would produce, over the following decade, the most extraordinary sustained construction binge in Las Vegas history. The Excalibur opened in 1990, a medieval castle-themed property at the south end of the Strip aimed explicitly at families and middle-market tourists who couldn't afford the Mirage's room rates. The MGM Grand rebuilt itself in 1993 as a 4,000-room Emerald City-themed property that was, again, the largest hotel in the world at its opening. Luxor opened in 1993 as a 30-story glass pyramid with a sphinx out front and a beam of light shooting from the apex that remains, to this day, the strongest beam of light projected into the night sky by any structure on Earth. Treasure Island opened the same year, with a pirate ship battle staged on the sidewalk several times nightly. The Forum Shops at Caesar's Palace, which opened in 1992, essentially invented the concept of the themed luxury retail mall and went on to generate more sales per square foot than any other retail property in America for years running, a statistic that still astonishes people when they hear it. And then in 1998, Steve Wynn opened the Bellagio, a 36-story tower facing a man-made 8-acre lake on Las Vegas Boulevard, featuring a fountain show choreographed to music that played every 15 minutes and became so famous it has been replicated in fountain installations around the world, an art gallery containing genuine old masters worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a restaurant collection that included some of the most acclaimed chefs in America, a hotel room product so luxurious it genuinely competed with the finest hotels in New York and Paris, and a casino floor that attracted the highest-stakes gamblers in the world to Las Vegas with a consistency and a volume that no previous property had managed. The Bellagio cost $1.6 billion. It worked. By every measure anyone could apply, it worked. The 1990s Strip construction binge did something to Las Vegas that the city has never fully come back from, in the sense that back from would mean becoming something smaller or less confident about its own scale. It established, in the global cultural imagination, the idea of Las Vegas as a place of essentially unlimited architectural aspiration, a place that did not accept the premise that anything was too large, or too expensive, or too fantastical to be built in the desert between the Spring Mountains and Sunrise Mountain. New York, New York opened in 1997 with a skyline made of scale reproductions of actual Manhattan skyscrapers and a roller coaster running around the outside. Paris, Las Vegas opened in 1999 with a half-scale replica of the Eiffel Tower visible from the whole southern strip. The Venetian opened in 1999 with canals and gondoliers inside a shopping mall built to resemble the Grand Canal district of Venice, Italy. By the end of the 1990s, you could walk 4 miles down Las Vegas Boulevard and encounter, in sequence, a medieval English castle, an ancient Egyptian pyramid, a Manhattan-esque urban skyline, Renaissance-era Venice, ancient Rome, 18th century Paris, and a tropical volcanic island, all in roughly the time it takes to walk from one end of a moderately sized university campus to the other. There is nowhere else on Earth where that sentence is accurate. There has never been anywhere else on Earth where that sentence was accurate. The population numbers during this period are almost as spectacular as the resort opening announcements. The Las Vegas metropolitan area, which had about 850,000 residents in 1990, reached 1,400,000 by 2000, a growth rate of roughly 65% in a single decade, making it by a substantial margin the fastest-growing major metropolitan area in the United States. New arrivals were coming from California, fleeing the early 1990s recession, from the Midwest and the South, drawn by construction jobs and hospitality industry employment, from Asia and Latin America and everywhere in between, creating in the process a city that was, demographically, dramatically more diverse and more complex than its mid-century gambling resort image suggested. The suburbs of Henderson and North Las Vegas and Summerlin and Green Valley were expanding so fast that entire neighborhoods that didn't exist in 1985 were fully built out and occupied by 1995, and the real estate industry, the home builders and the mortgage lenders and the title companies and the real estate agents became nearly as central to the Las Vegas economy as the casino industry itself. This is a fact that would matter enormously and disastrously later. Tourism numbers were keeping up with the physical growth. Las Vegas was drawing around 20 million visitors a year in the late 1980s. By 1995, that number was closer to 29 million. By 2000, it was approaching 35 million. Convention business, driven by the massive Sands Expo Convention Center and later the Las Vegas Convention Center, which underwent repeated expansions to become one of the largest convention facilities in the world, added an enormous year-round business travel component to a tourism economy that had previously been almost entirely leisure-oriented, meaning Las Vegas was filling its hotel rooms not just on weekends but on Tuesday nights in January, a feat that very few leisure destinations can pull off, and that made Las Vegas's overall occupancy numbers essentially unmatched in the American hospitality industry. The city was simultaneously the most visited destination in the United States by some measures, the largest hotel market in the world by room count, the largest convention market in the country by attendance, and still growing in all of those categories simultaneously. It was an economic engine of a scale and consistency that had no real precedent in American tourism history, and it kept growing. The 2000s brought another wave of development that pushed the architectural and financial ambitions of the Strip to a level that even the 1990s boom hadn't reached. Wynn Las Vegas, which Steve Wynn opened in 2005 after selling the Mirage and the Bellagio to MGM in 2000, cost $2.7 billion and deliberately rejected the themed spectacle model, no volcanoes or pyramids, in favor of pure luxury, an exercise in restrained, supremely expensive taste that attracted a different, wealthier clientele than the spectacle-oriented resorts and generated extraordinary room rates and gaming revenue from a smaller but far more financially powerful customer base. The Palazzo, City Center, Encore, these were billion and multi-billion-dollar projects that made the 1990s Strip construction seem almost modest in retrospect. Developments so expensive and so complex that they would have represented the defining projects of almost any other American city's entire commercial history, being treated in Las Vegas as just the latest additions to a boulevard that had already seen a dozen comparable projects in the previous 15 years. City Center, in particular, represents something unique even within Las Vegas's extraordinary history of excess. Opened in stages in 2009 and 2010, the project was a joint venture between MGM Resorts International and Infinity World Development Corp., a subsidiary of a Dubai state investment fund, and it cost approximately $9.2 billion, making it the most expensive privately financed construction project in American history at the time of its completion. It consisted of 5 interconnected hotel towers, a casino, a retail and entertainment district, and residential condominiums, all designed by an all-star roster of internationally recognized architects, including Cesar Pelli, Daniel Libeskind, Norman Foster, and Helmut John. It was in effect a mini-city within a city, 2,800 hotel rooms, a casino, hundreds of thousands of square feet of retail and restaurant space, all of it built on a roughly 76-acre site in the middle of the Las Vegas Strip. There has never been anything quite like it in American real estate development, and probably never will be again, because the financial conditions that made it possible, cheap debt, a housing bubble generating enormous paper wealth that flowed into discretionary spending, and optimistic projections about the continued growth of Las Vegas tourism, collapsed almost exactly as the project was being completed. Because this is where the story gets complicated, in a way that the pure mythology of Las Vegas's rise tends to gloss over, and it's important to sit with the complication for a moment, because understanding how Las Vegas nearly fell apart in 2008 and 2009 is actually essential to understanding both how it was built and why it has survived. The same cheap debt and financial excess that funded the extraordinary construction boom of the 2000s was simultaneously funding a residential real estate bubble in the Las Vegas Valley of historic proportions. Las Vegas home prices roughly tripled between 2000 and 2006, driven by speculative buying, easy mortgage credit, and the seemingly inexhaustible demand for housing in a city whose population kept growing faster than almost anyone could build. Construction workers, casino employees, mortgage brokers, and real estate speculators all became, on paper, dramatically wealthier during those years, and that paper wealth fed back into the local consumer economy and into the casino's own gaming revenues, as locals with inflated net worths spent more freely than they otherwise might have. When the housing bubble burst in 2006 and 2007, and the financial crisis hit with full force in 2008, Las Vegas didn't just face a national recession like every other American city. It faced that national recession layered on top of the most severe local housing market collapse in the country. Las Vegas home prices fell by more than 60% from peak to trough, a decline so severe it wiped out the equity of essentially every homeowner who had purchased after 2003, and pushed foreclosure rates to levels that were, at certain points in 2009 and 2010, literally the highest in the nation. Construction employment, which had been one of the biggest sectors in the local economy during the boom, essentially collapsed overnight as every major project either halted, scaled back, or went bankrupt. City Center itself, the $9 billion crown jewel of the boom, had to be restructured and nearly collapsed financially before its Dubai partner infused additional capital to see it through to completion. Gaming revenues fell sharply as both tourists and locals pulled back on discretionary spending. Hotel occupancy dropped. Convention bookings were down. Unemployment in Clark County hit 14%, one of the highest major metro unemployment rates in the country. By any reasonable measure, Las Vegas in 2009 should have been a city in genuine long-term trouble, a place that had vastly overbuilt during a boom funded by conditions that had now permanently reversed, facing a future of ghost buildings, chronic unemployment, and the lingering stigma of being the epicenter of America's housing collapse. And for a few years, that was genuinely what it looked like. The Fontainebleau, a multi-billion-dollar casino project being built on the north end of the Strip, halted construction in 2009, with the building 60% complete, and sat there, a hollow concrete skeleton, a monument to the crash, visible from the highway for years. The Echelon Place project, also on the North Strip, was canceled outright. Several smaller casino properties went into foreclosure. The conventional wisdom in real estate and hospitality circles was that Las Vegas had fundamentally overbuilt, that it would take years to absorb the excess capacity the boom had created, and that the city would look measurably smaller and less ambitious on the other side of the recovery than it had before the crash. The conventional wisdom was wrong. Not immediately wrong, the recovery was real and slow and genuinely painful for a city that had spent decades becoming accustomed to treating growth as a natural law rather than a condition that could be interrupted. But Las Vegas came back, and it came back in a way that demonstrated something important about how deeply the city had embedded itself in the American and global appetite for a particular kind of experience that didn't have a ready substitute anywhere else. Gaming revenue recovered, then grew. Hotel occupancy came back up, then exceeded pre-recession levels. Convention business recovered. The 35 to 40 million visitor per year figure came back and then kept climbing. And the city did something else. Something that in retrospect looks like the most important strategic adaptation Las Vegas has made since Steve Wynn opened the Mirage. It began systematically reducing its dependence on gambling revenue. For most of Las Vegas's history, gaming had been the engine around which everything else was organized. The hotel rooms were cheap or free because they existed to get people to the casino. The restaurants were heavily subsidized because they existed to keep people in the building. The entertainment was loss leader economics, a tool for filling seats in the casino. The whole economic model was essentially lose money everywhere except the casino floor, and make so much money on the casino floor that it doesn't matter. That model worked for decades, then started working less well as gaming became more geographically distributed across the country, with tribal casinos and commercial casinos in dozens of states providing competitive options for gamblers who previously would have had to travel to Nevada or New Jersey to play. Las Vegas's response, accelerating through the 2010s, was to genuinely, seriously shift toward a model where the non-gaming revenue, rooms, food and beverage, entertainment, convention fees, retail, nightclub and day club admissions, was the primary economic driver, with gaming increasingly becoming one amenity among many, rather than the fundamental reason for everything else to exist. By the mid-2010s, non-gaming revenue on the Las Vegas Strip had for the first time exceeded gaming revenue as a share of total resort receipts, a milestone that would have been essentially inconceivable to the operators who built the original hotel casinos in the 1950s and 1960s, and which represented a genuine structural transformation in what Las Vegas was selling. The entertainment and food and beverage transformation of Las Vegas during this period deserves particular attention because it produced something genuinely new in American cultural geography. The city, which had previously been famous for all-you-can-eat buffets, subsidized by casino accounting, and showrooms filled with entertainers past their commercial prime, became over the course of about 2 decades one of the most ambitious restaurant and nightlife markets in the entire country. The celebrity chef invasion that began in the 1990s, with Wolfgang Puck opening Spago at Caesars in 1992, and essentially demonstrating that fine dining could work in a casino environment, turned into a full-scale colonization of Las Vegas by essentially every major American and international chef of any ambition or reputation. Joël Robuchon, Thomas Keller, Alain Ducasse, Mario Batali, Jose Andres, Gordon Ramsay, Daniel Boulud, Emeril Lagasse, the list of serious, acclaimed, genuinely destination-worthy restaurants operating in Las Vegas casino properties grew so long over the 2000s and 2010s that food media began treating Las Vegas as a legitimate culinary destination in its own right. Not because it had a distinct regional cuisine or a deep local food culture, but because the economics of the resort model, where celebrity associations and high price points could be supported by an enormous and perpetually refreshed tourist base willing to pay for a once-in-a-Vegas trip splurge meal, made it genuinely viable to operate restaurants that wouldn't survive in any other American city. The nightclub industry underwent a similar transformation, with Las Vegas becoming over the course of the 2010s the undisputed capital of the superclub era, with venues like XS at Encore, Hakkasan at the MGM Grand, and Marquee at the Cosmopolitan commanding entrance fees and bottle service prices that made even New York nightlife look modestly priced by comparison, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue and turning a handful of DJ residencies into some of the highest-grossing live entertainment franchises in American music history. The sports dimension of Las Vegas's evolution deserves its own careful attention, because nothing more clearly illustrates how fundamentally the city's national image has shifted over the last decade than the story of how professional sports leagues that spent decades refusing to touch Las Vegas, citing gambling concerns, proximity to the casino industry, and fear that the association with betting culture would compromise the perceived integrity of their games, have spent the last several years essentially racing each other to establish a presence in the city. The Vegas Golden Knights, an NHL expansion franchise, launched in 2017 and immediately became one of the most astonishing expansion franchise success stories in professional sports history, reaching the Stanley Cup Finals in their very first season, a feat that had essentially no precedent in major professional sports, and building such an intense and passionate local fan culture almost overnight that it demonstrated something that Las Vegas skeptics had long doubted. A city that had always been defined by its visitor economy could genuinely support professional sports teams with a real, rooted, local fan base, because the hundreds of thousands of permanent residents who actually lived in